Perfect. Jasmine also made the amazing flyer on top of doing our opening today. So just to give her full credit.
Yeah, and this is all last minute, right?
As best as we could. All right. So the Noel recording. Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the World Social Forum, as well as the People's Inauguration. I'm Joshua Cooper with Hawaii Institute for Human Rights and the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance. And we'd like to welcome you to the Human Rights City Approach and Aspiration for a Biden-Harris administration first 100 days, the UPR adoption and implementation of international recommendations to realize human rights in the United States. It's an honor to have activists from across the United States coming to share the entire process around the UPR. But first, I'd like to begin with an opening by Chaslin Harada on Kauai, another community organizing to ensure racial justice and peace, and most importantly, respecting Indigenous peoples on lands that we're all meeting on. Chaslin.
Aloha mai kako, let us pray. E kia kumana loa mahala no kia la, no kia huipu ana o kako na mea ho'opale no ka la hui honua, ma ka pai aina a I pai aina, ma kia honua ni. Dear Lord, we are gathered together as a group of freedom fighters, as a group of defenders for our human rights, for all of our brothers and sisters around the world from every continent. And we are so blessed to be able to gather here today on behalf of those that we fight for, those who are here, those who are with us in spirit, and those who are coming, Lord. We bless that thou might help us in our endeavors as we continue to work on our initiatives to protect, to conserve, to preserve those things which matter most to us and to those that we fight for, Lord. We bless that thou might bless each and every one of our freedom fighters that are around the world, to invigorate them, to give them strength, to give them confidence, to continue the work that they are doing. And we're so blessed and grateful for those who have been voices to the voiceless. And we bless that thou might continue to guide and protect each and every one of us. And especially with this World Social Forum and talking about these issues, that more may hear and more may learn and may gain knowledge and insight on these things. And we see these things. Makaino kau kiki hiva hiva Yesu Christo. Amen. Amen.
Mahalo nui, Chaslin. Thank you for centering us. And mahalo also for an amazing flyer. The UPR of the United States has been a longer process than most of us had planned. The civil society reports were due on 3 October 2019. And many of us were very active as 2020 came about, as we were preparing for a spring review. It's great to see many of the people today because we were all together in Washington, D.C. on January, as well as in February. I believe for most of us, it was our last activity, February 27th in Washington, D.C., and then February 28th in New York City. And we were organizing panels focusing on the human rights activities, really known as a new process as the UPR Cities Working Group, working with around the country to coordinate what are the most imminent issues that we're facing. Today, we were going to follow up because the actual Universal Periodic Review took place on November 9th, really 1 week after the election. And now we are just the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration, and we thought it'd be an important time to discuss, because we do know now that at the next Human Rights Council session, the US will have the adoption of the report, and we thought it was an excellent time to strategize. And I also know the dates. It'll be March 15th through 17th. So that'll be the 3 days that it'll fall where the US report will officially be adopted. And that's an important strategy, and that gets us to the final stage where we're going towards adoption and implementation. So as we go throughout the discussions of what we're all doing, we'll also spend the last time to decide what we can do together to mobilize between February 14th, we figure, give us a little bit of time. We'll say we love human rights. That'll be our Valentine's Day from February 14th to March 14th to do a 1-month campaign to make sure that cities across the country are active, are engaging, and making sure that the recommendations that were provided by the missions really do reflect directly impacted people's voices and that the government accepts those recommendations. I would like to welcome our first speaker, Vicki Casanova-Willis, Dr. Vicki Casanova-Willis with the U.S. Human Rights Network on the board of directors, but also the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance. Vicki's, please, will you share with us some of the exciting work you're doing? And it's so good to see you this morning.
So much. If my week, I will mute my camera. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say what an honor and a privilege it is to be here sharing with this amazing group of educators, advocates, activists, human rights defenders, and human rights enforcers. And been blessed within the U.S. Human Rights Network, and also an emerging U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance collective. Really, really blessed to understand that, as Shula says, human rights is really, in essence, not something you do, it's something you live. And so we have to be about this every day. I'm gonna stop my video and hopefully that will help. And just to be really succinct, and then I'm gonna yield my time so that our other collaborators can go ahead and share with you. And then I'll be able to reclaim some of it, I'm sure, during Q&A or as we go forward. But I was just sharing that both the U.S. Human Rights Network, which is not quite 20 years in formation, and really took the lead to help both advance the human rights education here in the United States with regard to connecting grassroots individuals, organizations fighting for civil rights, and to be able to begin the process of engaging in the international mechanisms and really understanding and applying human rights as a much larger frame of reference, economic, social, civil, political, and other rights are something that we've not been accustomed to understanding here in the US, that this literally is what we all are entitled to, all of us, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, ability or disability, socioeconomic status, birth status, a legitimate, I don't even want to say legitimate, but a firm address designating our home, right? And so this awareness that human rights are what we all are entitled to and must aspire to is what has really sparked the idea of also bringing those human rights home. So that's really where the work of the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance, which is hosting this webinar today, that's really where that comes in. The idea that cities, communities, municipalities have a responsibility to utilize the proactive human rights framework to ensure dignity and justice for all. And I say that being married to a civil rights and human rights attorney for many, many years, doing tremendous work. But the civil rights frame that we are so often, that they attempt to box us into, right? Especially here in the US, is reactive, right? And it's very restrictive. So you have to wait for a harm to be done. And as you're going to hear, some of it is so egregious. And that's what the UPR has helped allow us to do, is to work with those directly impacted people to tell their own story. That's just been critically important for us, both to do the human rights education here on the ground, but also to lift as we climb. Time and time again, and I'll give you an example. as Josh was saying, we began this long process, which was a blessing, because rather than gear up for one reporting cycle, do these stakeholders reports, submit them, and then say, now what? We more and more are taking the approach that this is about us, right? Living human rights. What can we do? What can we identify? What do we demand of our legislators, our business owners, ourselves, to transform how we relate to others day in and day out, so that there is human rights budgeting, there's human rights, and just give me a thumbs up or a smile or a wave when I don't want to go over time. But it's a paradigm shift. It's a mental taking some brain in the decade of international decade for people of African, when such attention is comparatively is being given, is being given to the need to recognize, ensure justice, and then repair while we develop the human rights frame, and understanding how we bring those human rights home is also a part of that reparation. It's just tremendous, a new way of thinking and applying. So we literally helped enable the writing in the words of stakeholders reports, including U.S. political prisoners from the COINTELPRO civil rights timeframe, who, because of their advocacy and their insistence that there be locked down, locked up, and then infiltrated, and their movements shut down. They're still in prison. Mothers, some in their 80s, of young men who were tortured 20 years ago and are still locked up, tortured, innocent, into crimes in Chicago. So with that, I'll stop. But thank you for being here and for applying human rights at the city level as well.
Mahalo, Vicky. Excellent start for our panel, and really bringing up some of the most important aspects that we know the UPR is an important process because it brings all the human rights issues together, that in our stakeholder reports, we can cover anything in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can cover anything of the treaties that we've ratified, although that record of ratification is so pitiful, being the only country not even to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We can use anything the Human Rights Council special procedures and rapporteurs have said on the many country visits that you've been a part of to be able to host those rapporteurs and working groups, and then also anything a UN agency says about the country. But you also brought up a couple other aspects that's also excellent about the UPR, is it's also the decade of African descent, and that's what not many people would be aware of. So it's important to raise that we're halfway through that. And this year, of course, is also important because it's the anniversary, and I actually just found it cleaning this week, the Durban Conference from 31 August to 7 September, that important conference that too many people have forgotten. But we all know what's important about human rights. As you said, it's not just reacting to the racism and the systemic racism and bile that exists in our system, but it's being proactive and participatory and preventative. And that's the essence of human rights. It's that framework to forge freedoms out of that. And so I'd like to hand off to our next speaker, who's excitingly sharing with us an amazing agenda that's coming out of Pittsburgh. I know they're so busy right now with a whole bunch of activities, really bringing human rights home and organizing. And I'd like to welcome Clara Wiebel to present and share with us everything that's happening in Pittsburgh this week, but also what you've been working on. I know you even brought a bus to the February UPR briefing that we did in Washington, DC to meet with diplomats. So please share with us, Clara, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, and thanks, Joshua, for that introduction. My name is Clara. I've been working with the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance since the summer, and I'm like a recent undergraduate, so that's sort of a little bit about me. But today I'll be talking about just sort of an overview of the UPR process in Pittsburgh and what that organizing has looked like so far. Basically, we built from our existing network of partners, and we created the Pittsburgh UPR City Coalition team with a bunch of different groups, frontline community leaders working on housing, immigration, racial justice and gender equity, all of these types of things. And our purpose using the UPR, which was already touched on a little bit, was getting organizers on the ground involved with the UN processes, because the UN has so many great reviews and reports. So really just trying to figure out how these reports can be used on the local scale to apply pressure for bottom-up change. So as I mentioned, the team has all sorts of different leaders from the city's Human Rights Commission and the newly established Gender Equity Commission. So these are both city level efforts. The Gender Equity Commission was created by our Pittsburgh for CEDAW coalition efforts. So really just like building off of the past coalitions, that's like the pattern here, to create the UPR coalition team. We've been following the 3 C's of the UPR city strategy, collecting accounts of human rights conditions, compiling them in our local report to the UPR, and now we're in the clamor stage as we're engaging with community conversations and just trying to get the word out there and raise consciousness in that way. So first I'm going to go over sort of our collect and compile stages, but mostly we're focusing on the clamoring that we're doing now. So in the summer and fall of 2019, we hosted several community forums to identify key concerns and to generate ideas for recommendations on how we can improve human rights protections in our city. And since then, we've been in the compiling stage, and these forums have helped us shape the report that we submitted to the UN in October 2019, which is called Racial Inequity at the Core of Human Rights Challenges in Pittsburgh. And as Joshua mentioned, we did take a bus out in February, and that was like our final like in-person thing. So that's like always a marker for us. But we brought a group of 12 delegates with us to Washington, D.C., and we did the lobbying with international officials. And that's where our speakers lifted up local concerns around immigration rights, gender equity, transit, and demands for reparations for slavery and institutional racism. So following that, although the pandemic has complicated our work, we're trying to get the word out now, and we're convening a team of volunteers to draw from our UPR submission and from our community conversations to identify the priorities and lift up key recommendations that we want to organize around locally. So far, we've been working with a member of the Pittsburgh City Council to arrange public hearings for the rest of the council, so we can share our report and address our questions and just see how international human rights law applies to the city that, you know, we expect to be held accountable to these things. We're also looking at sort of similar instances and ways to use the sort of bottom-up, top-down pressure thing with our local government. The city adopted the CEDAW convention and also the mayor's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Recently, Pittsburgh conducted their first VLR. So we're just also looking at how that process could be made more inclusive to community on the ground. And we're actually looking at our UPR work to inform what we'd like to see us do with the VLR. We are working to support city officials' desire for more federal resources and support the implementation of international human rights laws with the general public consciousness raising and highlighting the national changes that we're seeing. So the creation of things like the National Human Rights Commission, police reforms, and greater public funding to ensure that human rights protections such as housing and healthcare are things that we have. So as we prepare to meet with the city council members over this winter, we'll be organizing some virtual public forums to help more people learn about the UPR process and the international calling for support to our public officials. We want to highlight some of the best practices from other countries that can be models here. And similarly with this CEDAW and the VLR. So we have like kind of a bunch of toolkit things happening in that way. But it's been really useful. I think the UPR set like a good precedent for the CDOT as well as the VLR work. So they're all sort of connected in that way. It's been really helpful for us to learn from folks in other cities who are also engaging in these similar demands. Residents are excited to know that the world is watching. And even though city officials may not be attentive to racial inequities and other human rights violations, the fact that the international community wants to hear our stories and that the UPR report is echoing our demands is really helping inspire and motivate people sort of on the ground. Yeah, I think that's all that I have, but thank you so much. And I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say as well. Thank you.
Mahalo, Clara, thank you. And it's great to see you again. And definitely the exciting work of the UPR cities, the stakeholder reports that were worked on by many of us at the Atlanta summit that took place in the spring, leading up to the submission of those stakeholder reports, making sure that you could see we were visionary. We were in Atlanta before it was now the hot Atlanta that everyone wants to talk about. And we knew that that was the place to meet in the South to make sure that we make sure the voice of the people in the South was heard and part of the process of the UPR. I'd like to also now welcome Kristen Noel, amazing friend who I've known for many other reviews of the US. And it'll be exciting to hear her speak. During this UPR process, when we weren't able to see each other as we normally would in Geneva, it was exciting to be with her on the EU and the UPR side events at 4 and 5 in the morning. But Krista is always there to be able to focus on the important issues that we're facing in Chicago. And I think she also has new research to share with us, not just on the civil and political rights she's been focusing on, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights, COVID-19, HIV, and AIDS. And Krista, we'd like to thank you so much and welcome you here at the World Social Forum.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Joshua. And I do miss you. I can't wait till we get past all of this and we can hang out together in Geneva again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm blessed to be here today speaking with you. And I wanted to thank Joshua and Vicky for organizing this panel and inviting me to speak. I'm also blessed because as an Africana woman who is statistically disproportionately impacted, I have survived one of the worst pandemics in the world since the US flu, otherwise known as its misnomer, the Spanish flu. Our charge today is to explain how grassroots organizing can take on international proportions and affect international movements. My involvement in the UPR process can be summed up by my actual statements during its review of the United States. And as we move forward in today's conversation, I'm sure we will speak more on the issues of giving voice to the voiceless. I begin with this statement that was made to the European Union as a part of the UPR US review on October 16th, 2020. I'm going to repeat that date, October 16th, 2020. This was presented to the European Union by the US Human Rights Network, Police Crimes, MIAT, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and Women's All Points Bulletin. We honestly believe we are living in a neo-Nazi state. I do not believe we had had such openly defiant and racist acts of violence since the days of slavery, Reconstruction, race riots, and the Civil Rights War. We presume the US is experiencing a long overdue racial injustice awakening when millions of people sustain protests against the killings of Black people, only to be met by violent police equipped with tear gas, rubber bullets, M14s, and armored cars. But nothing is ever binding in the US. It's just another pendulum swing. We live in a country that takes extreme comfort in its racist policies and practices, and our southern states still hold out hope that they will avenge the Civil War defeat of the 1860s, even though it was a traitorous act against the Republic. As we fight against racist idolization and insurgents and lynching of African people in America and the racist culture of our police, the popular narrative is anti-fascists are terrorists, while fascists are nice people. How did we get here? Why does America continue to fear full equality and equity for all its people? We live in a country that has slavery written into its constitution, whose police forces combine to kill no less than 1,000 people per year, even in states that have abolished the death penalties, where in both cases, African people are disproportionately impacted, and yet the US is considered the standard for human rights. We will only know for which this America stands when the results of the election are announced. In the interim, we humbly submit the following appeals. Demand the US pass the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Demand the US repeal the clause in the 13th Amendment that allows millions of incarcerated people to be enslaved. Demand the mandatory reporting of police killings under the Deaths in Custody Act and mandatory reporting from individual states. Demand an immediate end to police violence and support civilian police accountability councils, CPACs, democratically elected bodies that can design, implement, and monitor all policing policies, procedures, and prosecutions. Demand independent investigative bodies for police crimes, and that rape by police, which is considered torture by international law, and all acts of torture be fully prosecuted and victims receive reparative justice. Demand the end to incommunicado detention in our jails to protect us from police coercion and torture and Black ops sites. Demand all political prisoners, especially those from the Civil Rights War, be released and absolved. That one was at 2 o'clock in the morning. And 4 days later, I think I got a break on this one, and I got to start at 8. Who's next? Structural racism and police violence in the United States of America. We all watched the 8 minutes and 15 seconds of a white man kneeling on the neck of George Floyd as he and now witnesses of a murder begged him to stop. Everyone's cries went unanswered. After the pure horror of the trauma, 26 million people responded by taking to the streets, no longer begging, but demanding no more. Risking their lives during one of the worst respiratory pandemics in the world to march against police violence, the murder of Africans in the street, and the systems that allow it. Rubber and metal bullets flying, human beings on both sides suffering great bodily harm, including death, sacrificing life to sustain the charge for equality. Our country speaks of wanting to crush the anti-fascism groups because they ignore the calls for peace and continue to tear down statues, burn buildings, and break windows to end racist idolization and the thought that only the rich have power. Free all political prisoners, the forensics absolve Assata. Historically, this is our issue. This has been happening to us since we were snatched and sold from our homes in Africa. George Floyd is not an anomaly because we had Laquan McDonald before George, just like we had Rekia before Sandra, before Corrine, before Tatiana, Betty, and Brianna. No longer do we question if it will happen again. Our need to know is how many months the family has been fighting for justice. Is there video, and will it ever end? This history, the history behind the mass killings of African people is well documented. We have paper clippings, photographs, and postcards of lynchings, and yet the US cannot pass an anti-lynching act. Let us breathe. We were told we cannot charge genocide because genocide does not and did not happen to African people trafficked in the Americas, the Caribbean, and beyond. The African diaspora is simply systematically killed with no repercussions. This disturbance of the white psyche believes we are not equal, so why should we be treated as such? Mother Africa has no equal. Those who pretend things are different now know the truth. Our courts have not strayed far from the juries chosen to avenge the murder of Emmett Till, and the devil still lies. Mike Brown was murdered. There are those who believe our dignity as human beings can be challenged simply by tossing a banana our way. The entire world has been indoctrinated into believing that Africans are less intelligent and unworthy of dignity. We carry this burden within us. We walk through life so emotionally drained that our babies' low birth rates are manifestations of the ravages of racism that attack our bodies. Grieving for loved ones taken from us during a violent state-sanctioned act is not the only time our souls bleed. It flows when our bodies are raped and beaten and our minds so traumatized we commit suicide by fratricide. The American government has allowed African people to be murdered on the streets while assuring it will not protect safe retreat in our homes. We have been psychologically harassed to a point where the new question is whether we agree to define genocide as a persistent attack on the collective peace of mind of a people. Our legal standing is our bodies in the street. Our recommendations are acknowledge the genocide of African people and convene the Genocide Convention. Acknowledge America as a neo-Nazi state. Acknowledge that the Americas and European wealth was made on the backs of Africans and their descendants. Begin reparation discussions during the decade of people of African descent. And I bumped up my demand, or our demand, for mandatory reporting under the Deaths in Custody Act to monthly mandatory reporting under the Deaths in Custody Act. I had, before all of this, done some research on, and I called it Our Bodies, Our Blood, the Unconscionable Contributions, COVID-19, Exposing the Historical Experimentation on African People and Our Contributions to World Health. That one's a little long, so I'm just gonna jump to what I had as our demands. And CARICOM and Black sex workers supported this document. Terminate Dr. John Paul Mira. Dr. John Paul Mira is the one that said that we should do experimentation on the COVID vaccine on unprotected African women. Eliminate all biological testing in the African diaspora until the HIV/AIDS pandemic has been eradicated and informed consent is instituted as a policy and the willingness of both the country and its people is secured. Provide free, unparalleled healthcare to every member of the African diaspora within the state and country they reside. Ensure remedies and reparative justice is given to all members who were directly impacted by experimentation. Issue apologies from all state parties, including UN and its affiliates, Big Pharma, the medical research and scientific communities, and all entities involved in non-consensual, uninformed consent, biological testing. Begin a full investigation into the origins of HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa and the world. Provide free pharmaceuticals to all people and countries who were involved in the testing of effective treatments of HIV/AIDS. Answer why, after 30 years, there's no vaccination for HIV/AIDS. And that does it. And that just shows you how voices of the people are heard and were heard by the UPR. Thank you.
Mahalo, and thank you so much, Krista. And you bring up a lot of the points that in the names that we all have to remember, that we all have to make sure we keep organizing to make sure it never happens again. You know, Michael Brown, I remember that was around the last UPR, and all the meetings that we go to, there are too many names that we have to remember. And it's amazing to see what's going on with the event taking place, where they're actually looking at all the cases almost every morning, early in the morning, with Carrie McLean and others organizing that with the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. The other point that I think you brought up that was so powerful is linking all the issues. And what we can see also after the UPR that took place on November 9th is that many of those recommendations were cited in the UPR review, in that 3+ hours with over 116 countries asking questions, that the voice of the people was heard. Although we can admit they weren't as detailed as we had hoped, we of course can keep organizing to continue to move forward. I will now introduce Vincenzo to be able to share with us from New Orleans, and look forward to welcome Vincenzo to share some of the examples of what's taking place in the South. Vincenzo.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Vincenzo, and I am the former founding director of the Office of Human Rights and Equity for the City of New Orleans and the director of our city's Human Relations Commission. I left that position recently to start a PhD program in human rights at the University of London, and I'm proud to serve on the steering committee for the US Human Rights Cities Alliance, representing the Deep South, which I think is often erased from the national human rights conversation, but we're gonna correct that balance. Our UPR process in the city of New Orleans actually began in 2010 when community stakeholders convened at Xavier University, which is the oldest historically Black university here in New Orleans, to participate in this civil society consultation for the Universal Periodic Review. And this gathering session of community leaders identified certain areas that we needed to focus on, which were racial discrimination, environmental justice and sustainability, criminal justice, housing and economic justice, and health and healthcare. And so for consistency and to track our progress as a city, when we did our most recent submission on behalf of the city of New Orleans, we started with that foundation of those identified issue areas. And we did this process, this UPR report, in consultation with community and from a racial equity lens, because if the patient on the operating table is bleeding to death, you don't give them a pedicure, right? You got to stop the bleeding. And that is where all of the data, all of the information, fact, not an opinion, shows that the patient on the operating table is bleeding. So this report really is intended to be the voice for the community and a pathway to intentionally deconstruct systems that perpetuate disparity. And we have, international, we have help. We have a precedent for this. I liked your pen from the Durban Declaration. We have the Durban Declaration Program of Action. And I'm so happy that now people are finally realizing that racial equity is an operational thing. It can be operationalized. But I feel like the Durban Declaration and Program of Action back in the day is a great example of how this worked. People have been talking about it for a minute now. In the city of New Orleans, under these issue areas, I came to learn the importance of a municipal human rights office and a strong partner, having a strong partner in city government. But as we know, and as the human rights research shows, these offices are often used, they're often politicized, they're often weakened. I'm proud that when I was director before I left, I was able to work with many folks in community to get our office enshrined in the city charter so that it could help protect and minimize that politicization. But all of us, I think what I want to say, and I let the UPR report that we submitted speak for itself because it didn't come from me, it came from family, it came from community. But we have got to strengthen and educate and support and protect municipal human rights offices. Even when you have progressive leadership, in cities, we have got to create practices that allow these offices to speak the truth and independently. Even my UPR report, our communications team with the city of New Orleans wanted to vet it first, and I wouldn't let them. And it was a really, really big thing, right? Now, luckily, I was in an administration that was like, yeah, of course, it should be independent. But that is exactly the kind of thing that a human rights office, to be effective and to be an effective municipal human rights office, you have to sort of be embedded in policy, right? And in politics, because you have to get stuff done. You have to change the politics. You have to keep, our sheriff from cooperating with ICE. You have to make sure that we have systems to, we're rewriting NOPD policy and we do our racial equity plans to deconstruct systems that perpetuate disparity within city government itself, right? But on the other side of that, you need independence. And so all municipal human rights offices, and I think all of community, we need to create mutual accountability mechanisms so that that independence can shine through. And what I mean by that is this, I started this work in UPR, of course, when I was appointed the director of that office, the founding director, my job was to kind of use my privilege to start this thing so that other folks could carry it on. But when I really, really saw the graveness and the seriousness of it was the day after I was appointed, when not one, not two, but three Black trans women who lived in the city disclosed to me on their own terms, totally independently, their experience having been sexually assaulted repeatedly by the New Orleans Police Department, by people who are still in the New Orleans Police Department. And I say this because we have to, I ask myself, in our city right now, do we have an independent framework whereby somebody could get justice? Do we have an independent municipal framework, human rights office, whatever, whereby somebody could disclose that and they could be safe and protected? And of course, the answer was no. And the answer is no in most 9.9 out of 10 cities in the United States. And in the United States, human rights abuses happen in cities. That is how this country is able to mask its very troubling human rights record, because it's happening on the ground in a federal system and it gets sort of trickles down so much, it gets erased. But that happens every single day. And then that last thing I just want to say is, and everybody knows this, but let's just say it, we had a situation in cities where the United States government was tearing children from their mother's arms. And we were in a position where we had to very deftly navigate that under threat of, and I'm not saying like, funding that is, nice, happy stuff, like it's good to have funding, right? But serious funding that we needed to feed our communities was being held over our heads as cities. And to the credit of most of our larger cities and my own, we were like, whatever, and we did what we had to do in many cases to protect our people. But we have to ask the Biden administration and demand that never again will human rights offices, municipal offices have to have a very specific, independent, and set aside place statutorily, so that never again are we put in a position where we can't speak out against serious, serious human rights abuses like that. So I want to leave on that note. I think that cities are where it's at. I think that our municipal human rights offices can be where it's at when it's done from a lens of racial equity, when it's done with community accountability, which is hard. Not everybody wants to be held accountable by the community. I have been held accountable by the community. But it's not just a nice, fluffy, performative thing. We had serious stuff go down this past few years. And it's got to teach us to do better and to create statutorily systems that will make us do better. Otherwise, shame on us, right? After we went through all of this together. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Mahalo, Vincenzo, and thank you so much for sharing that experience from New Orleans. And you really did sort of look at this entire process. And it is important because a couple of levels, right? Human Rights Cities movement really was born in 1997 when we look at what was going on with the People's Movement for Human Rights Learning. They began to mobilize. They began to focus in Rosario, Argentina, to say, look, this is what we just survived with this dirty war. This is what we need. This was also a response because in 1993, the world adopted the Paris Principles because they realized national human rights institutions were also needed because there's those gaps in the different stages. And what you talked about with accountability is absolutely essential. And in Europe in 1998, Barcelona started a cities charter. And we know that it really wasn't until Washington, D.C. picked up the mantle here. And we can now see, though, from really that process that you're describing, from that second UPR in 2014-15 through this one, every summer there's been a gathering where we meet either in Washington, D.C. or in another city across the country to take stock, to see what's next, to learn also, as you said, from other cities, because that's where the human rights violations take place. And we can learn so much from there. And I think what you brought up also is linking all the human rights issues. People just don't do that enough. And that's why I also appreciated the example that Clara pointed out about SDGs. And I'll give one example, if I can pull that up. Here in Hawaii, we also were working on the SDGs. So here's that logo. And what we did is we indigenized the SDGs. And so on an exciting note, we do believe that we have to look at all the different mechanisms, looking at the Durban Declaration, as Vincenzo mentioned again, looking at the Decade of Action for African Descent, looking at these new Sustainable Development Goals. So we thought they look good. It's a good Rubik's Cube, but let's indigenize them and then make it more relevant to the people of Hawaii. So of course, we have it all in Olo'olo, Hawaii. We've got it looking at all the different aspects of what those 17 images mean to the people of Hawaii. And like Clara, we did a voluntary local review last year. And of course, the main part of a lot of our work is education. People need to know what their rights are. If you talk about SDGs, it sounds like something you don't want to catch, you know? So you have to say, these are really a reframing of the goals that existed with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's just 70 years later that the UN says, we haven't done so well on economic, social, and cultural rights. And that's the first 7, ending poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender justice, clean water. When you're looking at the COVID crisis, the first thing everybody said was to wash your hands and have clean water. We can't do that if we do not have access to the most important economic, social, and cultural rights that have too long been denied in the United States. And that really puts us to where we are today. And what's exciting about all of our speakers, with Vicky starting and Clara sharing, as well as Krista and now Vincenzo, is the process we've been in. Starting on that in the summer of 2019, getting communities together to say, do you know what your rights are? Do you know that UPR exists? Do you know the process? And in this stages, we've gone through the first stage, the preparation, where we really did talk about the 3 C's that Clara talked about, where we got to the clamoring point after we gathered and discussed everything. And then we submitted those reports to the UN. The exciting part now is, for human rights education, we have all the words of the people in that 10-page document and all the individual reports, including the UPR cities one. Then we started focusing on advocacy. And that was the main part we looked at in 2020. It was meeting with the missions in New York and in Geneva, meeting with the embassies in DC. And that's where we did the interaction, that second phase where we found what's the issue related to the specific articles, what's the question, what's the recommendation we have. And Krista pointed out those recommendations that had to be heard. And then November 9th was the consideration. It was that 3-hour plus review of the United States, where over 347 recommendations were made, many of them linked directly back to the communities that we met with to bring those issues forward. And now we get to the next phase. It's the adoption. And that coincides with the Biden 100 days. And that's where I think we're at today, is what can we do and how can we organize, really, since it'll be February 1 on Monday, take some time and reflect and think, but then plan a 4-week campaign from February 14th to March 15th, where we advocate and push the administration, but also organize on all the different levels of what we can do and how we can coordinate that. And that's the exciting part. And there's a couple more aspects I'd like to share, but I really want to bring it back to the panel after summarizing some of the most important points to look at. It's been quite a flurry. I mean, everyone that said that people would somehow miss the former administration and all the horrible chaos that was brought, and that it would be boring governance. It's been executive order after executive order. I think as a human rights community, we can reflect on how the climate justice community has really been able to push to make sure that rejoining the Paris Agreement on the first day, making the connection with economy and racial justice and climate all in one, pushing for the pipeline to be canceled immediately as it's impacted the water rights of indigenous peoples, that we might be able to look at 1 or 2 of the executive orders that Noel shared with us earlier, and it would be great to welcome Noel in as well, of what executive orders have been passed so far, but what are we aiming for in that first 100 days? Because we really do have, on March 15th through 17th, the US will accept recommendations or reject them. And then we have roughly a month and a half, roughly around Earth Day, for the first 100 days to be concluded. And we should have a good agenda where we map out the next 4 years, because we know we haven't done enough, and we have to be vigilant and resilient in our demands, as Vincenzo said, not asking, but demanding what has to be done, because we know if we don't organize in these 4 years, it'll be the same story again. And when I see Krista, I think back, oh my goodness, we still don't have a national human rights institution. And that's why it's been exciting to see how Human Rights Cities has been growing across the country, because people do know that that's where human rights begin. And so that's how we have to focus. People have mentioned a lot, and we know that first 100 days came about because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it's actually today was the day he was born. And he did bring up the 4 freedom speech. And the most important part was the economic, social, and cultural rights. There was the freedom of speech and freedom of worship, but also freedom from fear and freedom from want. And we have to not forget those and move with those. So maybe now we can think in this 100 days, how do we use that global, once again, as Claire brought up, to put pressure on the US to show that the world is watching and see what they accept, but more importantly, come up with a way, that roadmap, or how we move forward to realize human rights. So we can discuss some of those executive orders and some of those ideas. Were there any executive orders that people saw that they thought were really significant? And also some ideas for other executive orders as well as legislation on how we have to move forward in this new administration where they have the majority and can take action.
I see Vicky's hand is up, so I'm gonna
Okay,
recognize
let's start
her
with
at
Vicky
this
then.
time.
Yeah, I'm learning. I'm usually just a jump in person. If my connection gets unstable, I'll mute the video. You said at the last part of your statement, Joshua, thank you so much. What I was thinking, the reason I raised my hand too, is that again, I want to see more human rights language in everything coming out of every level of leadership, government, and grassroots here. So that's part of our human rights education work, right? And I love the translation that you all shared from Hawaii of the Sustainable Development Goals, right? That's also something, I mean, literally we could do with our first and second graders even. Children have a remarkably clear perspective of what is right and what is fair and what is just, right? Just naturally until the world begins to train them. So I think about that in terms of these executive orders, just very quickly putting a human rights translation on them. And then also the fact that, and understandably so, the fact that they are reactive in large part, sometimes responsive, like you're saying, yes, we have a racial health pandemic, and also, racism is a public health crisis. And we also have the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would argue we have a neo-Nazi white nationalist pandemic. Remarkable. If you heard those words that Krista shared, and I was up at 3 a.m. with her delivering with Joshua and so many others testifying to the EU. October 16th of 2020, that wasn't after January 6th. So how prescient that we know what the issues are and we see the threat, and now other people are. So long story short, I wanted to say, I look at many of the executive orders as reactive because they had to be, right? In the gridlock and with the filibuster still in place, the Biden administration said clearly they were going to undo those most egregious executive orders that had been in place, right? But I want to lift up again one of the UPR advocacy testimonies that we were able to do. And I think we had something like we designed and crafted a forum, and then invited the missions to come and participate with our U.S. Human Rights Network colleagues from, you'll remind me, Krista, from the ACLU, CCJ, and I apologize for all the acronyms. I was reminded this morning that, that's the opposite of accessibility and transparency, not intentionally, but in this human rights arena, we have to be really good about not talking in code. But the amazing thing is bringing the grassroots directly impacted people. And I mentioned the report from a former COINTELPRO political prisoner advocating on behalf of his brothers and sisters who are still behind bars for being activists. That's it. And they are aging out. And some of them have dementia. I've just learned, Sundiata Akoli. There's no reason to not have a compassionate release for these people who were never a threat to anyone anyway, other than, ideologically, because they believed in the self-determination and protection for their people. The other report came from African nationals who had also experienced family separations at not the US-Mexico border, but children being separated from parents at the airports as they're coming in from those Muslim banned countries, quote unquote, largely many African descendants. Another report was a cultural genocide report. So stepping back to say, in addition to the fact, and I like this education EO that says, no, we're not gonna totally whitewash the history or further whitewash the history, and we're not gonna penalize and criminalize people for learning about their indigenous history and culture and brilliance and genius. But we also need to, I would like to see some of these executive orders go further. And the cultural genocide piece was about literally clearing the airwaves. I won't read it to you, but it's also something we shared with when we hosted the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent back in 2016. The informal education process through the media, through the airwaves, through Clear Channel, and which is iHeart, they call it No Heart Radio, and so many others. We have to examine every aspect of this system and see that these media conglomerates are governed by the FCC. So there are challenges that people at the communities and cities level are leveling every day, increasingly using human rights language, and I'll stop with this, but not always. But I think we need to do a little translation exercise on these EOs now, and note what's missing, what is being required by some very strong considerations and conclusions that we are getting back from the international mechanisms, and bring that agenda forward in the first 100 days and let them know, the clock doesn't stop ticking. We put you in office and we expect you to work. Thank you.
Mahalo, Vicky. Are there any other aspects about the executive orders that have been adopted so far, and aspects how those link to a lot of the work that we're doing today with human rights cities? And then we can also look at some of the next steps. I know Clara might be able to share. It's an exciting week in Pittsburgh. You have many things going on this week, focusing on the right to housing. There'll be a screening of The Shift, looking at housing as a human right, and former Special Rapporteur Leilani Farr, who's focusing on housing as a human right and linking all the issues together. But is there any initial ideas coming out of the executive orders as well that others want to identify and discuss? And I agree with Vicky that we need to put those into human rights language, need to link those to what should be done. I think we all know there's no national action plan really focusing on racial discrimination, which was one of the things that was supposed to come out of Durban action in each country. As we talked about earlier, there's no national commission on human rights. So we have a lot of activities that we can begin to mobilize for that will then enrich, of course, this human rights cities movement. You know what?
Yeah. Thanks, Vicky and Josh, for this panel and this necessary conversation that we have to have. We have to have timely conversations in order to responsibly and responsively connect the truths and legacies of our people and our struggles to how we engage on process, progress, and policies that engage us in systems change, right? So that's very important, I think, to engage on and thinking as human rights defenders. It's always important that we think about educating or motivating and organizing at the speed of trust with people, and truly centering what we are doing in the legacies of places, right? I think it's very important to be thinking about that. And I'm seeing this flurry of executive orders that are being signed. And I agree with Vicky full-heartedly that, yes, these are definitely reactive, but they are responsive to some degree, but they will become people-centered policy if we inform it, and we have to inform it, and we have to continue to do the work of accountability, people to government, so that the governance is where we are also, engaging in that. We have room to engage in the governance and not be caught up in the symbolic nature of what the executive orders potentially represent for the most part, right? So that's something I have been thinking about, and just want to lift up that Southern folk, a lot of us Southern people, I'm an immigrant from the southeastern part of India, making Jackson, Mississippi home. And Jackson is home to me because of the indigenous Black and brown communities of people who are native to Jackson and Mississippi that allow me to build and make Jackson home for myself, my son. So I just want to say that as the grounding that I have, and also how the ancestral energies of Black, indigenous, and brown communities, including my own ancestors, continue to guide the work that I have to do in my community that I call home, that is home to me. One of the things that we were able to engage on is when these presidential candidates were running, right? That was 2-3 years ago when they were running for office, all of them. We were having a conversation, several conversations about why do they always end up asking us to endorse them? They always look to mayors, they look to celebrities for endorsing. Why don't they ever endorse an agenda of the people? So we ended up creating the Southern People's Agenda. And the Southern People's Agenda was translated into the Southern Mayor's Agenda, and some of the mayors of Southern cities, progressive young Black mayors, they actually wrote a letter and submitted the agenda to all the candidates that were seeking presidential office, and almost everybody responded. The Biden's team, particularly, almost every candidate responded, some of them with 13-page responses to our 4-page ask. But Biden's team reached out to us, and we had a sit down with the Biden's team, with the folk who were engaged in the process at the grassroots level, and then they also met with the mayoral teams. 2 things happened, right? And one of the things that I heard back is that listening to communities share an agenda that spoke to the truths of the Southern people helped them to create their own process. So all that to say that they did it with communities across the country, of course, and all that to say that our work should continue. We should inform the creation of agendas. We should push for agendas to become policy. And we should also help with governance. And we should continue to hold them accountable if things go wrong. And our work is all of that. We have to educate, motivate, and organize to do all of that. In order to be able to do that, we should have a lens of racial equity, a lens of economic justice, and a lens of ethical leadership, a lens of food sovereignty, a lens of health equity. And without those lenses to inform how we lay the foundations for our own capacity to be built, I think it'll become projects. Things will remain at the project level where we are checking off boxes. We have to engage in cultural change. We have to think about it as a shift, which means when we tell our stories, we are telling the stories of communities, and community and people are the heroes and not us. We are stewards, we are co-workers. And that's the kind of aspiration I have for how I want us to remind ourselves of what Vicky was saying earlier about, how do we language the executive orders in the human rights way so that when we push it for the people, with the people. So that's what I'm hoping we as Human Rights Cities Alliance and as Human Rights Network, we continue to do that work with love and accountability. The late Mayor Chokwe Lumumba, at his inauguration in 2013, he ended with this statement, and it's such a powerful statement, and I have to uplift that. I'm also a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. He said, if you don't love the people, sooner or later you will betray the people. And I also want to say, he also mentioned Frantz Fanon and generational mission. He said that both of them, he said in context to how he's embarking upon his radical municipal leadership, he said that each of us have to do the work of our generations as individuals, and we have to lean in to do it as communities too. But the only way that would build, sustain, and thrive is if we are informed by a set of beliefs, values, and principles, and we commit to staying in principled struggle with one another. And that's how we continue to free the land.
Hello, Noel. And that's definitely that spirit of solidarity that we have to nourish. And as you raise those points, health equity, food sovereignty, those are all the points that have been really ignored for too long and distracted with other aspects. So that's where we need to go. And I think what you were bringing up there with Frantz Fanon, with getting to that understanding, we do educate, we do mobilize, and now we're getting to the point where we need to realize these rights. And those are sort of the 3 steps that we need to move forward during this time. In the UPR, it's crazy, it happens every 4.5 years, but it's at least just to remind the country and to make sure that we all talk about human rights at least every 5 years, because otherwise it's those false aspects that people pursue of profit, GDP, things that don't matter to people. And it's just asking us to ask the question of how are we doing? Vicky raised about the Convention on the Rights of the Child being implemented at the city level and the state level. And yes, when we had that conversation in Hawaii to adopt the CRC and to ratify it, it was crazy the people that came out against us. If people came out and said, and didn't know what they were talking about, and this was a decade ago, they said when the CRC was adopted in France, blood spilled in the streets. And we're like, wrong revolution, a couple 100 years early. But now I was concerned about homeschooling when they didn't know those basic facts. And that human rights framework is important because it's, as Noel brought up, it's people-centered. And all of our policies are usually so much top-down without talking to people and not including the voice of the people. And that's why the human rights lens is directly impacted people's identifying, most importantly, what's wrong, because they live it on a daily basis. But as Noel points out even more, what we want, because you can ask anyone what's wrong and they can say it, but more importantly, they know exactly what needs to change because they face the roadblocks set up by processes and policies that are to perpetuate the system of racism that Krista mentioned earlier. Are there any other comments to build on Noel's and Vicky's so far? We still have enough time for everyone to be able to share.
I have.
Yes, Krista.
I have a comment about Biden's. I mentioned in my statement that it's a pendulum swing, it's back and forth and back and forth. So Trump went in reversing Obama, and now here comes Biden reversing Trump, and the next one can come in and reverse something, and the next one can come in. And the question is, how do we make sure that these policies, the good ones, the moral ones, right, remain in place? And I think that's really important. And here in Chicago, we're fighting about, I noticed, I went through, Joe Biden has 45 executive orders, and one of them had to do with children going back to school. And one of the issues that we have in Chicago right now is that the teachers are like, well, it's not safe, and it's not safe for us. And then there's this question of vaccinations, right? You're vaccinating cops before you're vaccinating teachers, but you're forcing the teachers into the classroom with people that they're in contact with when cops are driving around in cars. So it's really funny how we really just don't prioritize correctly. We don't think about our children. I was looking at the numbers because I really wanted to know, because the scientific data says that, you know, children may have a natural immunity to COVID. But I've also read about how some children who got COVID are now having problems with processing, right? Because COVID is a combination of the bird flu, I think it was originally called, or it is a bird flu, and HIV. So it not only attacks your respiratory, it attacks your immune system. So you're putting children in these situations where their immune systems can be attacked. And you're putting teachers who are older people who will and can be susceptible to death in these situations. And, you know, the conversation isn't around vaccinating the kids and vaccinating the teachers. It's just around pushing them back in the schools. And Joe Biden, executive order, said, let's do it, you know, because scientifically the kids will be okay. But what about the teachers, and what does it mean for one child to go back to school and die? You know, what is our responsibility if that happens? You know, and I don't think we put the value on life of anyone, including our children, like we should. So, you know, I appreciate some of the things that Joe has done, which is just, you know, swinging stuff back and forth. But I worry that some of it is pushing us at too high of a speed towards death, to put it bluntly.
Yes, Chris, I know you always hear the argument on the environment and climate that there's no jobs on a dead planet. And I saw a great sign coming out of Chicago, like, dead teachers can't teach, you know? And I think it's an important point. We're looking at essential workers and how teachers, of course, are always put to the space. And of course, it's also a lot of parents are probably like, let's get kids back. And the truth is, we have to think of it from a human rights-based approach. And a human rights-based approach to the COVID crisis connects all the intersectionality of all the issues that people don't want to start pulling the pieces to then have to address that as well. But in 2020, it seems like everything came to the forefront. It's the first time we're all busy, but we also are all at home. And so everyone has a time to take a moment to see what is really going on and where are we and where should we head. But excellent points, Krista, especially as one thing I think that's important with the new administration is it's not blind loyalty. We are there to say, we know you were easier to move and that you have to be pushed, and that too many people I know after Obama was like, woohoo, he's in, not in this group. But we have to make sure now everyone has that same approach of just vigilance for 4 years to push to make sure that it's not just a pendulum swing, but we have huge systematic changes into the structure. Good note, I know we have a good 15 minutes left. I think we have one question from Chanlin. You're not seeing double. They actually are two different people. I call them the good double trouble. It's Chaslin and Chanlin. So Chanlin, I think you have a point that you wanted to raise, and the police are coming for me, but keep going, everyone. I'll be fine. Go ahead, Chanlin.
First off, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation for everyone and your efforts and your testimonials and just sharing your knowledge with all of us. I feel like I'm currently pursuing my bachelor's degree in the UH system in the University of Hawaii. But I feel like, I believe Dr. Casanova, you touched on it about transparency. And I feel like in our educational system, we've had a lot of Hawaiian activists who are currently teachers and professors, like Professor Cooper, who are doing their best efforts to address us, the up and rising generation, on the truths of the issues that we are facing. And so I guess not necessarily a question, but more of like, I guess, advice for us, the young generation coming into this. Not that we can solve, problems overnight, but how can, you know, my questions that I ask myself is how can I, you know, coming up and pursuing my education, best focus myself so that I can be an advocate, like Noah was saying, a steward, right? The heroes are the people that we advocate for, the voiceless, right? We've been speaking about the voiceless people, and so just listening to everything that was addressed so far, I've been taking notes the whole time. But you know, these kind of gatherings and forums that we have really do help to build on the knowledge that we already have from our ancestors and just from personal life experiences. But like what was addressed, you know, we need to have more of these types of meetings that help to inform the people of actual truths, and not just doing the pendulum swing of she's wrong, he's right, and then just going where the wind blows you, but being able to make educated decisions and educated comments, you know, on factual things and truths that you see with your naked eye. You know, we don't have to have the third eye to see things. It's not invisible. We're living in an era like, I think it was Krista, I may be wrong, who said a really strong statement that we're living in a world, in a state that supports a neo-Nazi mentality, and it's accepted, and it's like, how do we, like, we're living, I'm in a system, an educational system that also supports that kind of mentality. So it's like, you know what I mean? We have so many of these, you know, we want to call them top dogs or leaders, right, in our world, who are teaching us, like teaching the rising generation. So it's not like we can change a person, but it's like, how do we hold them accountable where they can keep teaching truths of the actuality, the issues and the things that we're facing today, so that we don't repeat it. I feel like when Professor was bringing up of all, you know, the deaths that were happening of defenders of human rights, you know, we don't talk about that as often. And the issue of human rights is not focused on enough in the educational system, because what they don't do is they don't make the issue of human rights apply to the individual. And the fact of the matter is that because you don't know what you have and you've earned, it's not even, it's your right. It's not like a yes or no question. Does this apply to me? It applies to you. So we're trying to help children, right? The innocents. We're trying to help the innocents from a young age, because they know better. Like, you know, they're smarter than us at times too. And we're, you know, we're supposed to be experts or whatever, right? To inform them. But even they know right from wrong. And it's keeping that innocence within them and not destroying them from a young age and informing them with misinformation and things that you think are important. No, we need to start teaching them what their rights are from a very young age, so that when they face the world today and when they come to these, you know, did what this person do to me right or wrong? Is that, you know, touching or anything like that, you know, in regards to the body and just real reality, that they can say, no, that was wrong. No, you abused me. Yeah, I think abuse is something that we don't focus on enough, even within the home. And now with COVID and the pandemic, I've seen some Native Hawaiian families who have taken on the responsibility to now educate their children on what they believe, which is their core values, which is their culture. There are some, though, and many know this in minority groups, and especially with Native Indigenous people, that they face a lot of stuff at home, which is, you know, their families are less fortunate. So, and they have, you know, maybe domestic violence within the home. So most kids don't come from, you know, stable with two parents working. Like you're working with single mothers, single fathers. So there's just so much barriers, you know what I'm saying? And education to me has been an outlet, but that's because I've been fortunate to have people to inform me of the truth. But it's like, you know, how do we get that for every child in our educational systems? I feel like that's where there's a huge gap. When we talk about creating the bridge, that's one of the huge gaps that, you know, I'm wanting to help to build on, so that they can walk across a bridge that's stable and it doesn't do the pendulum swing and cuts off for them where they fall to their deaths. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's just a lot of things that I'm thinking about, but I really do appreciate everything that everyone has said. And thank you for all that you're doing behind the scenes and on the scene. It's truly appreciated. Thank you.
Mahalo, Chandlin. And you brought up a really good point. And so much people don't know about every community. Kauai really mobilized against Monsanto, Syngenta, who are really poisoning communities, putting all the pesticides so close to the school. The kids would all have to go to a hospital when the winds changed course, and they were able to then adopt and write new laws. And that was a big part, and it is still a big part of the Human Rights Cities movement, is focusing on multinational corporations and their impacts when they come into cities and towns and then try to direct the policies and practices. So thank you, Chanlin, for sharing a bit from Kauai. I think, Noelle, you had your hand up as well. I thought I saw it briefly. So I want to hand it to you. We have a good 10 minutes left, so we can also have everyone share next steps and some aspects there as we move forward. But Noelle.
I want to yield the floor to Vincenzo, and then I can come back and say what I wanted to say.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, Noelle. I guess I have to say something now. Well, I do want to say something about the point you made about education, because I think that is the key, and there's no simple answer to that, right? Absolutely no single one best practice or answer that we can all just take home with us and then it's all going to be good. But I think that the struggle that we're having regarding human rights education starts with decolonizing and, just decolonizing our imperialist perception of ourselves in the United States and our human rights situation. So let's break it down for a second, right? We live in an unstable country. We live in an unstable country. We have a lot of, people of color in this country have known this for a long time, but people that look like me have been sort of protected from that, from the effects of that, right? We are now finally in these executive orders, I'm seeing a general acknowledgement of the threat that white supremacist organizations have had in this country for a long time, and how they have been so deeply embedded in our law enforcement systems. And that's a fact. That is, but because we have these imperialist views, we haven't decolonized our perception of ourselves, we will look at the same behavior in other countries and call it out. And we need to start looking at ourselves like a deeply unstable country that is in a serious democratic crisis. And we need to fight like hell to ensure that democratic reforms are made in this country as if we're looking at another country entirely. Because it is another country entirely. It's not the country that we thought we had. That starts with this work, right? Documenting human rights abuses. And when necessary, confronting even well-intentioned neoliberal governments in cities that are progressive, right? For not directly confronting human rights abuses in our law enforcement, in our schools, in the types of behaviors that we absolutely would not tolerate and we would completely call out in any other part of the world. But because we haven't decolonized our own minds, we are seeing ourselves as, it's just, it's this little small fire we have to put out here. It's this little small fire we have to put out there. And unfortunately, we are in a deep democratic crisis. So when you're a country that's under a deep democratic crisis or just a crisis in general, you have to start documenting human rights abuses. You have to start creating systems that protect and create accountability. If you cannot create those within the government, we have the government ostensibly now maybe for like 4 years perhaps. If you can't create them, you create them outside of the government and you create shadow systems, right? That's what you do when you go into a conflict zone. And we have to really see ourselves in that place. We are in a low-level conflict right now. And the only reason we don't see that is because we haven't decolonized our minds.
Absolutely agree with Vincenzo. Of course, the South always has something to say. I want to say that.
And we've been working really hard in the South.
Yes.
And we do have a lot to say. And so I just want to always say this, that our reputation has never, the reputation that we have in the South as being this awful, terrible place. We have always fought this. We have always been fighting. We have always been resisting down here. And many more people better than me have been doing it for a long time. So I just want to give voice to all of the folks and take a moment to think about all of the folks in the Deep South that have never, since, you know, I'm living in a house that was built by a free person of color, right? That never allowed or accepted what was being imposed upon them in the South, and never will.
That's right. That's right. Chandlin, I want to, embrace you and thank you for what you brought up as to what young people's, questions are, concerns are. I want to say that it's very important. I think I'm not assuming, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. The growth and evolution of understanding struggle comes to me because of the political homes that I was able to be part of, that I was invited to be part of. I think it's very important, and this is something I want to, Clara and Chandlin and Chaslin are the young people or the youngest people in the crowd we have today, right? I just want to, as a former HBCU professor too, right? And I just want to acknowledge that it's very important that you all have political homes, that we all have political homes that are intergenerational and principled, where we can continue to learn with each other, grow, and build the community that we all deserve. Continue to build movements, and it's not just in formal educational spaces, right? And I want to recognize the role that HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, Native American institutions, and Hispanic serving institutions, which are known as the minority institutions in our country beyond our homes, the political homes, which are more informal. Beyond that, I think we should also ensure that our institutions, anchor institutions, play the role they need to play in how we need to decolonize, how we need to become racially equitable, and how we need to continue the work of liberation and policy change. I think that's very important to recognize and put the work with these institutions. And also, folk in predominantly white institutions need to ensure that those predominantly white institutions shift towards racial equity. They need to, because reparations are very important. We need to recognize that the erasure of Native communities is actually taught in our syllabi, right? And it's very important to create people-centered syllabi and pedagogy that teachers engage students on. Otherwise, once students finish undergraduate studies or graduate studies, they are gone. Whatever they have done remains a project-based understanding, and there is no continuity because they are not actually deepening their roots in community. And that's something, those gaps that exist are something that we need to be thinking about in the more formal education processes. What is that pipeline of learning and growing and doing what we need to do, the change work that we all need to do? How is it rooted in our community, in the values of our community, in the change that our communities deserve, right? That's kind of like that big piece that I'm thinking about. How do we, do the work individually to undo the white supremacy that exists in our thinking, which is what Vincenzo was referring to so eloquently as the decolonizing piece, the decolonization of ourselves, decolonization of our communities, the decolonization of our institutions, the decolonization of our systems, and the decolonizations of philanthropy. All of that has to happen. All of that has to happen. And thank you for uplifting and just so powerfully reminding us all to think about our work, our generation's mission to bridge the gaps of learning together and growing together. Thank you, Chandlin.
If I may add something real quick. So you brought up an excellent question. Fortunately, again, I grew up in a family that was very part of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. But in addition to that, I grew up understanding my culture. And so, sorry if I butcher your name, I really apologize. Vincenzo, is that how you say it? Okay.
Exactly.
yeah, your point of decolonization. So this is something that that my people within my own family are starting to realize is an issue. And you know, when they talk about whitewashing, well, there's also a white pen that can write off mistakes and write off accountability, can write off anything, right? They've created not just the white eraser, but the white pen. And so you know, white whatever, right? That's their favorite color. But in hindsight, though, in order for what I've been able to have the, you know, the blessing of is growing up in a community where I grew up learning about culture. My culture was first, and in addition to that, I grew up, you know, having to learn about regular educational things for when I was a child. But see, not and not most people are fortunate to do that. I speak my native tongue. And the only and what has been my saving grace is that due to the efforts of my ancestors and those before me, they have preserved that knowledge and the practices of my people, so that when it comes to us addressing the issue of colonization, it is not a question, right? We come to the situation, we present ourselves understanding that the issue is present, and that the answer to solving the issue is us, the people. And I feel like, Noelle, you keep bringing back to focus about community and the people and serving. In our culture, those who were leaders were really the ones who served the people. They did not sit on a high horse or sit in a chair and direct orders blindly. They were considered to be leaders of the people because the people respected them for what they did. And every person in our culture, within our communities, had a purpose. And so we are, and again, like I'm going to go back to education, there's not enough focus on the cultural importance of the indigenous people, wherever you may be. Here in Hawaii, we're lucky that we have professors who are being advocates for us, for our people, and practicing what they know. It comes to you know, this kind of a standpoint or a standoff where it's our say versus their say. And when I refer to the their, it's anybody in opposition of what we're fighting against, anyone. And that may very well be, and the issue I see more often within our different institutions is that those people may consist of your own, those of your own ethnicity, your own culture background, people who identify as Native Hawaiians or whatever you identify as, your own people may be criticizing and fighting against you. And so like it's understanding the fight, it's understanding the issue, but it's understanding that decolonizing your mind and decolonizing your way of life and how you think, your mentality is possible, as long as you make your culture and who you are a priority. Because you can't come into any situation not knowing who you are, where you come from, and what you're meant to do. That is, I feel like if you don't know what you're meant to do, you have time to figure it out. But really, we don't have that much time, because we're having, with this whole new administration, we're having to act. And so I appreciate, again, thank you, Noelle, and thank you, Professor Cooper, for giving me this opportunity. I don't speak on behalf of all, but just on my own personal experience. Us, the up and coming rights generation, we're learning how to be ourselves and how to be one with ourselves, and accepting the faults and accepting the triumphs that have been afforded to us because of those who are still actively pursuing and fighting on our behalf, and those who have come before us. And that instills humility for all. And that's what we're lacking in the nation, in the continental US, is humility. There's too much, vigor to be number one, but really humility is what is necessary also to decolonize how we operate as a people.
Mahalo, Chandler, and I think that
And
is,
I'm sorry, can I oh shoot, my culture, they say the ancestors are proud. So thank you. Ashe.
Vicky, I think it said you were muted, but we didn't want to mute you at all.
Oh, yeah, you did. That's okay. I wanted to say thank you and mahalo asante sana to you as well for always being willing to be an ally, right? That's what the Human Rights Cities Alliance is about. Each of us is so super busy, right? And not just busy being busy, but busy, as you've already heard, doing very impactful, very courageous work. We have directly impacted people right here on this call. When you think about how sometimes telling these stories over and over can be very healing, but it also can be triggering and re-traumatizing. Yet the courage that people have and the commitment and the tenacity says, you know, that it's really important that the World Social Forum 2021 and a virtual platform is able to hear and access this conversation. So I just want to say thank you for opening the door, and for everyone else for responding so quickly and so eloquently to make this. I appreciate you all. I love you. And I believe that we will win.
That is one of our best ones. I believe that we will win. Exactly. And I really do appreciate everyone's perspective. I mean, there's so many points to keep grabbing and pulling. I think Vincenzo also brought up a really good point when he said to recognize where we're at. Like, that American exceptionalism has got to be challenged. And that's the important point there. And to recognize what I think we've all learned, and that kind of gets us to where we're headed, right? The Human Rights Council meeting is going to happen in February 22nd, and then it'll be 4 weeks long. But we always knew in the human rights movement in the US, those been involved with US Human Rights Network, as well as our burgeoning US Human Rights Cities Alliance, municipal multilateralism, we can learn so much from our colleagues around the different countries, that at the Human Rights Council, when they bring up issues, too often US NGOs aren't there with all the other NGOs saying, what can we do and how can we do this together? And that's what the UPR does, expose all of us. Is like, look at what exists. And that's one of, I think, the positive parts about the UPR is after it's done, I'll never forget, we did one thing with Chris and she's like, what's next? Like, it's the last day at Geneva. It wasn't, okay, oh, I got to go back and I got so much more work to do in Chicago. She was like, Josh, what's next? What's the other instrument that I can use to then push what I'm already working on? And I think that's the healthy perspective we have. It's not, oh, it's the UN's doing reports, so let's write a report. It's what we're working on already, that we know what matters, and how can we utilize the UN to be able to increase the understanding and to broaden, as we talked about, beyond the civil rights to what Brother Malcolm was talking about, the human rights, that we're all born. No government hands these rights to us. They have a duty. They're the duty bearers, and they have been horrible at that one task. And why have a government if they can't do that? And that's where the municipal multilateralism really brings us in to say, look at what other cities are doing and how amazing they're doing it. And this is one point where we're at where we've never been. I do know normally when the UPR review happens, like on November 9th, everyone's like, I've got so much more to do and go back. But we have some time now. This is for the first time ever in a UPR review. We can start a campaign, not only for the adoption, but really at the implementation. And that's when the real work begins. And that's when most people sort of unplug because we have so many other things to do. But I really feel in this third cycle, there's that commitment. So I was thinking, yes, on February 14th, we love human rights. We love each other, as Vicky just said. And that's a good time to launch a campaign, a 4-week campaign. And in that campaign, we pick Realize My Recommendation was a hashtag we had, Realize My Recommendation, where everyone can talk about the recommendation that was made on November 9th that must be adopted. But we also can do something new we've never done. In one of those weeks, after February 14th, the next week, we reach out to local elected officials, mayors, state legislatures, city councils, and say, do you know about the UPR and these recommendations? How will you localize this recommendation that was made in Geneva here on the ground? And then I know we need to reach out. Members of Congress, talk to them, have a briefing, have a hearing that says what should be done, and realize how they would implement that recommendation in laws. That's something that we need to do. And then I would say the The third one is federal agencies. Reach out to Health and Human Services, reach out to HUD, Housing Urban Development, reach out to Department of Justice, Labor, and say, these recommendations relate to you. What are you doing? And push towards that. And then the final one is the US president. The Realize My Recommendation campaign on March 15th. What will you do with these recommendations and how will we move forward? And the one last thing I would say is we really have to push State Department in Geneva to pick the dates when they're going to meet us again when we go home. The problem is State Department always says, aren't you happy we had the review? You know, just give us some time. And the truth is, no, we need to know from that day on March 15th through 17th, when the next meeting is, when the consultation is, how are you including cities, which mayors are going to be on a task force to implement these recommendations, and have a plan, because then we can really work on the implementation side. And that's where we need to go, because before, I admit it, you know, I'd be so happy when we had the review and I'd be the one pushing for, we need to push State Department, and they would be like, no way. But we know now what doesn't work. And we know also from learning other countries doing their UPRs, what could be better. And I think the cities element we've included, we did really well. We did Birmingham at the first one, and the mayor hosted it for the second cycle. We did Atlanta this time. And I know that we're looking, when it is safe, we'll be able to meet in New Orleans with UPR cities. And with that US Human Rights Cities Alliance, we can take those recommendations and hopefully meet when we're all healthy, and then see how we do and what we do in this 4-year strategy, thinking of it in a 4-year plan, and then continuing then even longer term with hopefully CERD review will come up, and how do we bring it for the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the ICCPR and Human Rights Committee, that we just keep reinforcing it and tightening and making sure that we get stronger as we keep moving forward. We know we're a little bit over, but Chandler was on such a great note. We didn't want to end there. So I will give it though to each panelist just 2 minutes of maybe next steps or actions we'd like to take, if that sounds good. And then I really do want to thank everyone for coming together, for pitching in and being able to participate with the People's Inauguration and linking with that Biden's 100 days, but also connecting with the people's movements around the world and the World Social Forum. Because we also know the World Economic Forum was meeting this week, and there was definitely no discussion about what we care about there. And so with this World Social Forum, how we can continue and to grow from the ground up. So I hand it to fellow panelists, and whoever wants to go next. Or we could go from reverse. We could go, since Vincenzo was last, we'll start with Vincenzo then.
Oh gosh.
Then go Krista.
Okay.
And then Clara, and then Vicky.
Well, I like to think big. And so I think that, you know, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, what we did in our office that I think was, you know, I had a lot of bad ideas, but one of the good ideas I had was taking the Paris principles and trying to apply them and operationalize them within a local municipal human rights office. I think we need to envision like how we really believe these local municipal offices should function, by what principles they should function, what are the best practices, how they should link, you know, up the chain, and also how they should relate to community. Because it would have been very helpful to me if I were on a city council or having been, you know, appointed the director of that office or whatever, to have had just right in front of me how things should look. Because I think what everybody knows this, most of the human rights commissions in most of the cities in the United States are created in ordinance only, and they are neither funded or functioning, or if they are funded and they are functioning, they have no power. They're just there to do like diversity trainings and do performative woke things and make people feel good. So we have to create a real strong set of principles of accountability, of like what local governments, you know, what systems these local governments should create. And we do have a lot to draw from, and how they should relate in community and then up the chain again. And for me, the Paris principles were a good place to start.
I want to just add to what Vincenzo just said and say that the executive order on racial equity, that's one thing that we can push so that we can ask the Biden government to not just think about racial equity, but connect racial equity to human rights and provide funding for cities and communities to engage on those processes and to create processes of change that become policy and governance and at the local levels, right? And so I think that's something we, as a Human Rights Cities Alliance and the network, we should be working on, that language and then also pushing that with the government at the federal level. I think that is something as strategy that we could be working on.
Very good. Krista.
Okay, I am here. I'm going to get down to very specifics that, are part of the recommendations and, working, like you said, at the different levels to get them implemented. Universal health care needs to be implemented. It can start at the city and build up, or he can, he wrote a executive order on it. So let's see where we can take it over time. I think the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act needs to go quickly. I mean, it's sitting out there. There's no reason why it hasn't been signed. I think it's been like 100 years since it's been some kind of anti-lynching act has been in front of Congress. And then I really have a problem with the fact that it's been 30 years since the pandemic of HIV/AIDS, and that there's no vaccination. And I want to start fighting for vaccination for HIV/AIDS, since it is decimating certain African communities and could eventually end up decimating all of Africa if we don't get a vaccination against it as soon as we can. So those are my big three.
Mahalo. Clara.
Hi, so I guess thinking about the UPR, VLR, all of these sort of things that we're trying to bring home, we're working with some of our partners at the University of Pittsburgh to try and like institutionalize it that way. So like thinking about the city and the community and like the university, like where we can go from there. But we're still doing some housing stuff that you mentioned. I'm posting the flyer in the chat here, but we're hosting a screening of the film Push, which is Leilani Farha's documentary about like all these housing problems that are happening around the world. If you look at the flyer, there's a way to like get a free link to view the film, but there's also a webinar coming up Monday night now. And there will be different housing activists from Pittsburgh, New York City, and Atlanta. So it'll be really cool if everyone could hop on and hear what they have to say.
Clara, way to go as an activist. You are right there plugging the next event, going to the next aspect. You are definitely living and learning exactly how to do it. Jackie would definitely be proud with that strategy there. And it is an amazing event. And thank you so much for sharing the next activity. And I'll now hand it to Vicki.
Hey. Well, I think that this conversation continues, right? There are a couple of things that have been dropped in the chat, so we can continue to stay in touch with each other and then help other people connect, because sometimes, honestly, we just need to focus on the self-care of, I wish I were in Hawaii and could sit by the ocean and look at the waves, but maybe it's whatever it is, right? Wherever you are, bloom where you planted. And yet we know that this networking and organizing in that way truly does work. So continue to bring someone else along with you. The link for one, please reach out to the U.S. Human Rights Network. Please also, Noel dropped in a link to the Human Rights Cities May 1st wiki, okay? Because sometimes folks literally want to have human rights education And they can just email and say, hey, for example, I called on Joshua and Susana Sandoval, who's a member of the Indigenous Peoples, oh gosh, I'm going to say it wrong. But anyway, she's a commissioner on the Human Rights Commission on the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples, because one of our new U.S. Human Rights Network board members was also a human rights commissioner in Reno, Nevada at the time. And he said, you know what, it's kind of like what Vincenzo said. He said, we have human rights in our name, but I want my colleagues to know what that means. So we literally just did a Human Rights 101 presentation for them. Are totally happy to share, slides and PowerPoints and co-create knowledge. And also we learn every time we talk with and meet with, I've learned today at the World Social Forum Virtual 2021 by hearing from and being in community with you all. So that's at the basic level, just continue to reach out. And then concretely, again, I think there's a translation exercise that we need. We've been doing this for, 20 years. It feels like at least close to that, with the CERD, the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Committee Against Torture, right? Winning a measure of justice for police torture crimes in Chicago. And a grassroots group of folks did what you all have talked about today, which is also write into legislation and created and got a bill passed and got the governor to fund it, helping provide the only recourse for people who have been locked down in some cases for 20 years for tortured and confessing to crimes as teens that they did not commit. So we don't have to stop with the law. And we didn't know anything about a human rights city movement at the time, but that's what we're doing, was bringing human rights home. So thank you. I just think we have to look at all the recommendations that have come out. Let's just say UPR and plug them in, figure out where they apply, how they expand on and address some of these current executive orders, and where we need new ones. And then ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child already.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And really, that's the best way to close. I'll never forget how Vicki came and even was continuing to organize, and the benefit of adding the Geneva work as another layer and an avenue for advocacy and its impact back home. And so I think that's what we do is and as you said, we didn't know there's a human rights city movement. We're just doing the work that need to get done. And I always point out the Chicago examples as one of the most promising practices. And you can say you continue that as well when you host the working group on African descent. And every time there's an opportunity, we see that it's a way to organize and deepen the discussion and make sure we have bigger impacts as well in all of our work. And lastly, what Vincenzo said too, he brought up Paris principles, but we'll have a new avenue with the Paris Agreement. That's also decolonizing, decarbonizing, decentralizing. We can do not a nationally determined contribution like the UPR is for human rights, but we can do an LDC, a locally determined contribution, because that's where we know you can see where all the environmental racism happens and takes place. So we have to coordinate from there. So we'll keep the spirit of Paris alive. We'll keep organizing this municipal multilateralism, and we'll keep working on the issues. So I want to really thank everyone for participating at the World Social Forum. We'll be very active for the next month throughout the adoption of the UPR, beginning with our We Love Human Rights campaign on Valentine's Day, and keep going throughout the summer. And then hopefully we'll be able to see each other in New Orleans very soon. And that's where we'll continue. All right, thank you everyone. And thank you for making time, of course, even on a Saturday. Human rights don't sleep. Human rights is always involved. So we'd like to thank everyone for taking time, and we look forward to our next event coming up around the Human Rights Council. We should probably have a side event on human rights cities at that Human Rights Council so that other human rights cities around the world can connect with us as well. Mahalo, thank you.